Habits That Handicap by Charles B. Towns. First Preface. It is interesting to note that a year or more ago a few deaths from bichlorid of mercury poisoning caused within a period of 6 months a general movement toward protective legislation. This movement was successful, and after the lapse of only a short time the public was thoroughly protected against this dangerous poison. It will be observed that the financial returns from the total sale of bichlorid of mercury tablets could be but small. Had the financial interests involved been of a magnitude comparable with those interested in the manufacture and promotion of habit-forming drugs, I have often wondered if the result would not have been less effective and as prompt. Bichlorid of mercury never threatened any large proportion of the public, and those falling victims to it merely die. Opium and its derivatives threaten the entire public, especially those who are sick and in pain, and with a fate far more terrible than death, a thraldom of misery, inefficiency, and disgrace. Lest somewhere there be found within the pages of this book remarks that may lead the reader to suppose that I unduly criticize the doctor, and therefore that I am the doctor's enemy, I feel that it behooves me to add that in the whole community he has not one admirer more whole-souled. Second Preface. Some years ago Mr. Charles B. Towns came to me with a letter from Dr. Alexander Lambert, and claimed that he had a way of stopping the morphia habit. The claim seemed to me an entirely impossible statement, and I told Mr. Towns so. But at Dr. Lambert's suggestion I promised to look into the matter. Accordingly, I visited Mr. Towns' hospital, and watched the course of treatment there at different times in the day and night. I became convinced that the withdrawal of morphine was accomplished under this treatment with vastly less suffering than that entailed by any other treatment or method I had ever seen. Subsequently, I sent Mr. Towns several patients, who easily and quickly were rid of their morphia addiction, and have now remained well for a number of years. At that time I had the impression that the treatment was largely due to the force of Mr. Towns's very vigorous and helpful personality, but when subsequently a similar institution was established near Boston, I became convinced by observation of cases treated in that hospital that Mr. Towns's personality was not an essential element in that treatment. His skill, however, in the actual management of cases from the medical point of view was very hard to duplicate, and Mr. Towns generously came into New York when called upon, and showed us what was wrong in the management of cases which were not going well. I do not hesitate to say that he knows more about the alleviation and cure of drug addictions than any doctor that I have ever seen. All the statements made in this book, except those relating to tobacco, I can verify from similar experiences of my own, since I have known and used Mr. Towns's method of treatment. I do not pretend to say how his treatment accomplishes the results which I have seen it accomplish, but I have yet to learn of anyone who has given it a thorough trial who has obtained results differing in any considerable way from those to which Mr. Towns refers. The wider applications and generalizations of the book seem to me very instructive. The shortcomings of the medical profession, of the druggists, and those who have to do with the management of alcoholics in courts of law seem to me well substantiated by the facts. Mr. Towns's plans for legislative control of drug habits also seems to me wise and far-reaching. He is, I believe, one of the most public-spirited as well as one of the most honest and forceful men that I have ever known. I am glad to have this opportunity of expressing my faith and confidence in him and my sense of the value of the book he has written. Richard C. Cabot. Introduction. There is only one way by means of which humanity can be relieved of the curse of drug using, and that is to adopt methods putting the entire responsibility upon the doctor. Until the present legislation was passed in New York State, no one had ever considered the doctor's responsibility. This most valuable medical asset and most terrible potential curse had been virtually without safeguard of any effective kind. Discussion of the drug problem in the press dealt wholly with those phases which make themselves manifest in the underworld or among the Chinese. I am reasonably certain that, until very recently, the world had heard nothing of the blameless men and women who had become drug users as the result of illness. This seems strange, since there are in the United States more victims of the drug habit than there are of tuberculosis. It is estimated that 15% of the practicing physicians in the country are addicted to the habit, and although I think this is an exaggeration, it is nevertheless true that habit-forming drugs demand a heavy toll from the medical profession, wrecking able practitioners in health and reputation, and of course seriously endangering the public. I have elsewhere explained the fact that the medical man himself is ignorant of the length to which he can safely go in the administration of drugs to his patients. If he is ignorant of what quantity and manner of dosage constitutes a peril for the patient, is it not reasonable to suppose that similar ignorance exists in his mind with regard to his own relations with the drug habit? As a matter of fact, I know this to be the case. Many physicians have come to me for help, and 99% of them explained to me that their use of drugs was the direct outgrowth of their ignorance. If the man who practices medicine is unaware of what will bring about the habit, what can be expected of the medically uneducated citizen who is threatened by those in whom he has most confidence, his doctors? The wide extent of the drug habit in this country has not been apparent. The man suffering from a physical disease either shows it or makes it known. The man suffering from the drug habit presents unfamiliar and unidentified symptoms, and far from being willing to make his affliction known, through shame he tries to conceal it at all hazards. Until legislation forced the victims of drug habits by hundreds into Bellevue Hospital in New York, this great institution rarely had one as a patient. The sufferer from tuberculosis would seek this hospital, feeling that there he might find measurable relief. The drug user shunned it, for he was doubtful of receiving aid, and above all, he dreaded deprivation without relief. No man or woman will go to any institution for relief from the drug habit where the only treatment offered is that of enforced deprivation, for he or she knows perfectly well that deprivation means death. No human longing can compare in intensity with that of the drug user for his drug. Unrelieved, he will let nothing stand between him and it. Neither hunger, nakedness, starvation, arson, theft, nor murder will keep him from the substance that he craves. Clearly, humanity must be protected against such an evil, and the physician must be saved from it, for saving him will fulfill in a large measure the demand for the protection of the public. After the experience of the medical profession of New York State with the workings of the Boylan Act, it is scarcely probable that strong opposition to similar legislation will be made in other states. Even if other states delay in the enactment of right legislation, the Boylan Act may be considered not only a protective measure for the profession and the people of New York State, but it may be safely accepted as an educational pronouncement for the benefit of the medical profession everywhere. It establishes, for the first time, the danger line. End of the prefaces and introduction.
Marianne. Habits That Handicap by Charles B. Towns. Chapter 1. The Peril of the Drug Habit. It is human nature to wish to ease pain and to stimulate ebbing vitality. There is no normal adult who, experiencing pain or sorrow or fatigue, and thoroughly appreciating the immediate action of an easily accessible opiate, is not likely in a moment of least resistance to take it. Everyone who has become addicted to a drug has started out with small occasional doses, and no one has expected to fall a victim to the habit. Indeed, many have been totally unaware that the medicine they were taking contained any drug whatever. Thus, the danger being one that threatens us all, it is every man's business to insist that the entire handling and sale of the drug be under as careful supervision as possible. It is not going too far to say that, up to the present time, most drug takers have been unfairly treated by society. They have not been properly safeguarded from forming the habit or properly helped to overcome it. It has been criminally easy for anyone to acquire the drug habit. Few physicians have recognized that it is not safe for most persons to know what will ease pain. When an opiate is necessary, it should be given only on prescription, and its presence should then be thoroughly disguised. A patient goes to a physician to be cured. Consequently, when his pain disappears, he naturally believes that this is due to the treatment he has received. If the physician has used morphine in a disguised form, the patient naturally believes that the cure was effected by some unknown medicine. But if, on the other hand, he has received morphine knowingly, he realizes at once that it is this drug which is responsible for easing his pain. If he has received it hypodermically, the idea is created in his mind that a hypodermic is a necessary part of the treatment. Thus it is clear that the physician who uses his syringe without extreme urgency is greatly to be censured, for the patient who has once seen his pain blunted by the use of a hypodermic eagerly resorts to this means when pain returns. Conservative practitioners are keenly aware of this responsibility, and some go so far as to never carry a hypodermic on their visits, though daily observation shows that the average doctor regards it as indispensable. The conservative physician employs only a very small quantity of morphine in any form. One of the busiest and most successful doctors of my acquaintance has used as little as half a grain in a year, and another told me that he had never gone beyond 2 grains. Both of these men know very well that only a small percentage of drug takers have begun the practice in consequence of a serious ailment, and that even this small percentage might have been decreased by proper medical treatment directed at the cause rather than its symptom, pain. An opiate, of course, never removes the cause of any physical trouble, but merely blunts the pain due to it, and it does this by tying up the functions of the body. It is perhaps a conservative estimate that only 10% of the entire drug consumption of this country is applied to the purpose of blunting incurable pain. Thus 90% of the opiates used are, strictly speaking, unnecessary. In the innumerable cases that have come under my observation, 75% of the habitual users became such without reasonable excuse. Beginning with small occasional doses, they realized within a few weeks that they had lost self-control and could not discontinue the use of the drug. Forming the habit. A very common source of this habit lies in the continued administration of an opiate in regular medical treatment without the patient's knowledge or consent, or of a headache or catarrh powder that contains such drug. The man who takes an opiate consciously or unconsciously, and receives from it a soothing or stimulating or pleasant effect, naturally turns to it again in case of the same need. The time soon arrives when the pleasurable part of the effect, if it was ever present, ceases to be obtained, and in order to get the soothing or stimulating effect, the dose must be constantly increased as tolerance increases. With those who take a drug to blunt a pain which can be removed in no other way, it is fulfilling its legitimate and supreme mission and admits of no substitute. Where it was ever physically necessary, and that necessity still continues, an opiate would seem inevitable. But the percentage of such sufferers, as I have said, is small. The rest are impelled simply by craving, that intolerable craving which arises from deprivation of the drug. But whether a man has acquired the habit knowingly or unknowingly, its action is always the same. No matter how conscientiously he wishes to discharge his affairs, the drug at once begins to loosen his sense of moral obligation, until in the end it brings about absolute irresponsibility. Avoidance and neglect of customary duties, evasion of new ones, extraordinary resourcefulness in the discovery of the line of least resistance, and finally amazing cunning and treachery. This is the inevitable history. The drug habit is no respecter of persons. I have under my care exemplary mothers and wives who became indifferent to their families, clergymen of known sincerity and fervor who became shoplifters and forgers, shrewd, successful business men who became paupers because the habit left them at the mercy of sharpers after mental deterioration had set in. But the immediate action of morphine by no means paralyzes the mental faculties. Though when once a man becomes addicted to the drug he is incapacitated to deal with himself, yet while he is under its brief influence his mind is sharpened and alert. Under the sway of opium a man does venturesome or immoderate things that he would never think of doing otherwise, simply because he has lost the sense of responsibility. I have had patients who took as much as 60 grains of morphine in a single dose, an overdose for about 150 people, and about 50 grains more than the takers could possibly assimilate or needed to produce the required result. An excellent illustration of how the habit destroys all judgment and all sense of proportion. Against this appalling habit, which can be acquired easily and naturally, and the result of which is always complete demoralization, there is at present no effective safeguard except that provided by nature itself, and this is effective only in certain cases. It happens that in many people opium produces nausea, and this one thing alone has saved some from the habit, for this type of user never experiences any of the temporary soothing sensations commonly attributed to the drug. Yet this pitiful natural safeguard, while rarely operative, is more efficacious than any other that up to the present has been provided by man in his heedlessness, indifference, and greed. Dangers of the hypodermic syringe. I have seen over 6,000 cases of drug habit in various countries of the world. 95% of the patients who have come to me taking morphine or other alkaloids of opium have taken the drug hypodermically. With few exceptions, I have found that the first knowledge of it came through the administration of a hypodermic by a physician. It is the instrument used that has shown the sufferer what was easing his pain. I consider that among those who have acquired the habit through sickness or injury, this has been the chief creator of the drug habit. This statement does not apply to those who have acquired the habit through the taking of drugs otherwise. My work has been carried out almost entirely in cooperation with the physician, and I have not come in contact with the underworld drug takers. I consider that the syringe has been the chief creator of the drug habit in this country. In 1911 I made this statement before the Ways and Means Committee of the United States Congress, then occupied with the matter of regulating the sale of habit-forming drugs, and I personally secured the act which was passed by the New York Legislature in February 1911 to restrict the sale of instruments to buyers on a physician's prescription. Before that time all drug stores and most department stores sold hypodermic instruments to anyone who had the money. A boy of 15 could buy a syringe as easily as he could buy a jackknife. If a physician refused to give an injection, the patient could get an instrument anywhere and use it on himself. This bill has passed only a single legislature, but I am arranging to introduce a similar bill before all the others, and hope to have the state action confirmed by a federal bill. At present in Jersey City, or anywhere out of New York, anyone may still buy the instrument. It is inconceivable that the syringe should have gone so long without being considered the chief factor in the promotion of a habit which now alarms the world, and that as yet only one state legislature should have seen fit to regulate its sale. Restricting the sale of the syringe to physicians, or to buyers on a physician's prescription, is the first step towards placing the grave responsibility for the drug habit on the shoulders of those to whom it belongs. Habit-forming drugs in patent medicines. The second step to be taken is to prevent by law the use of habit-forming drugs in patent and proprietary medicines which can be bought without a physician's prescription. Prior to the Pure Food and Drugs Act, created and promoted by Dr. H. W. Wiley, druggists and patent medicine vendors were able, without announcing the fact, to sell vast quantities of habit-forming drugs and compounds prepared for physical ailments. When the act came into effect, these men were obliged to specify on the label the quantities of such drugs used in these compounds, and thus the purchaser was at least enabled to know that he was handling a dangerous tool. Except in a few states, however, the sale of these compounds was in no way restricted, and hence the act cannot be said to have done much toward checking the formation of the drug habit. Indeed, it has probably worked the other way, for there is perhaps not an adult living who does not know that certain drugs will alleviate pain, and people who have pains and aches are likely to resort to an accessible and generally accredited means of alleviation. Yet the difficulties in the way of passing the Pure Food and Drugs Act are a matter of scandalous history. What, then, would be the difficulties in passing a federal bill to restrict the sale of patent medicines containing habit-forming drugs? It is, of course, to the interest of every druggist to create a lasting demand for his article. There is obviously not so much profit in a medicine that cures as in one that becomes indispensable. Hence arises the great inducement, from the druggist's point of view, in soothing syrups and the like. In this country all druggists, wholesale and retail, are organized, and the moment a bill is brought up anywhere to correct the evil in question, there is enormous pressure of business interests to secure its dismissal or satisfactory amendment. To show the essential selfishness of their position, it is only necessary to quote a few of the arguments used against me before the Congressional Ways and Means Committee when I was making a plea for the regulation of the traffic in habit-forming drugs. They claimed that registration of the quantities of opiates in proprietary medicines would entail great bother and added expense, and that these drugs usually combined with others in such a way as to result in altering their effect on the user, and that, anyway, so small an amount of these drugs is used that it cannot create a habit. Now, as a matter of fact, the combination of medicines in these remedies makes not the slightest difference in the physiological action of the drug. Further, it is found that, just as with the drug itself, the dose of these compounds must be constantly increased in order to confer the same apparent benefits as in the beginning. And finally, it is well known that what creates the craving is not the quantity of the drug, but the regularity with which it is taken. A taker of 1/8 of a grain of morphine 3 times a day would acquire the habit just as surely as a man who took 3 grains 3 times a day, provided the latter could tolerate that quantity. The average opium smoker consuming 25 pills a day gets only the equivalent of about a 1/4 grain of morphine taken hypodermically, or of a 1/2 grain taken by the mouth. A beginner could not smoke a 1/4 of that quantity, but still he acquires the habit. Any amount of the drug which is sufficient to alleviate pain or make the taker feel easier is sufficient to create a habit. A habit-forming drug having no curative properties whatever is put into a medicine merely for the purpose of making the taker feel easier. One wholesale house alone prepares and sells 600 remedies containing some form of opiate. Most of the cases of the cocaine habit have been admittedly created by so-called catarrh cures, and these contain only from 2 to 4% of cocaine. In the end, the snuffer of catarrh powders comes to demand undiluted cocaine. The taker of morphine in patent medicines, once the habit is formed, must inevitably demand undiluted morphine. This easy accessibility of drugs in medicinal form is more dangerous than moralists care to admit. The reason why opium smoking has been, up to the present, less prevalent in the United States than in China and some other countries, is probably that the preparation of it, and the machinery for taking it, are not convenient. If opium smoking had been generally countenanced in America, if the sale of the pure drug had been for generations permitted here, as it has been in China, if houses for its sale and preparation had been found everywhere, if its social aspects had been considered agreeable, if society had put the stamp of approval on it, opium smoking would be as prevalent here as it has been in China. Our human nature is essentially little different from that of the Chinese, but lack of opportunity is everywhere recognized as a great preservative of virtue. Due allowance being made for the difference of moral concepts, our standards of morality and honesty and virtue are certainly no higher than those of the Chinese. Thus, were the conditions the same in both cases, there is no reason to suppose that opium would not be smoked here as much as there. But fortunately it has not yet become thus easy, convenient, and agreeable, and consequently that particular phase of the evil has not yet reached overwhelming proportions. On the other hand, the alkaloids of opium administered hypodermically or as ingredients in many patent medicines are thus convenient, and as a result this phase of the evil has reached overwhelming proportions. Nor have we any cause for congratulation upon our particular form of the vice, for opium smoking is vastly less vicious than morphine taking. The traffic in opium. Something more is needed, however, than mere restriction of the sale of hypodermic syringes and patent medicines by any one legislature or country. All persons who handle habit-forming drugs should be made to give a strict accounting for them, otherwise the traffic can never be properly regulated. 4 years ago, by special act of Congress, all importation of prepared opium and of crude opium designed for smoking purposes was prohibited. In the ample interval between the passage of the bill and its going into effect, the importation of opium was simply phenomenal. By the time it went into effect, the American dealers had learned the secret process of preparing opium for smoking, which had hitherto been known only in the Orient. Thereafter it was found that since responsible importing houses were still at liberty to import crude opium in any quantity for general medicinal use, the retailers could buy, and were buying, from importers all the crude opium they wished and preparing it themselves without having in any way to account for the use they meant to make of it, although that use had now become illegal. The result was that the smoker could get opium more easily than before, since the secret process of preparing it had become known, and having no longer to pay the enormous tax on prepared opium, he got it much cheaper. In short, the only difference was that the government lost about $1,500,000 a year in revenue, while the vice was greatly increased. Thus the act had worked in precisely the opposite way from the intention of the framers, and all because men are permitted to handle opium without accounting for it. Until there is such an accounting, there can be no real regulation of the opium trade. Congress has just passed a bill aiming to regulate the traffic in habit-forming drugs. I wish to go on record here as saying that this bill will not accomplish its purpose, and should be further amended to prove effective. But it will only be a matter of time when there will be amendments proposed which, if adopted, will create legislation on this subject worth while. The history of the Opium Commission appointed by Mr. Taft is sufficient to show how any less comprehensive regulation would act. When Mr. Taft was Governor General of the Philippines, he found that an enormous quantity of opium was being smoked by the natives, and the large Chinese settlement, of whom it was estimated that 55,000 were smokers. He appointed a commission headed by Bishop Brent, now stationed at Manila, who has since headed 2 international opium conferences, at Shanghai in 1909 and at The Hague in 1911. Mr. Taft sent the commission into the most important opium-producing countries to find out how they were dealing with the problem and what progress was being made toward decreasing the use of the drug. The nearest approach they found to a reform was the method of the Japanese in their newly acquired island of Formosa. Japan, with the most stringent regulation of the sale of opium in the world, had made it a government monopoly in Formosa, had compelled the registration of all smokers, and was gradually lessening the amount which each smoker could buy. After the exhaustive report of the commission, our government adopted the same tactics in the Philippines. To the surprise of the officials, they found that out of the 55,000 opium smokers they could obtain a registration of only from 10 to 12,000, which meant that the great majority were getting smuggled opium. By special act of Congress, the authorities at Manila were allowed to stop the importation of opium entirely. But this, while it meant a great loss of revenue to the local government, apparently did not lessen the amount smoked. After the sale was stopped, there were virtually no voluntary applications for opium treatment, as there must have been if anybody's supply had been cut off, which conclusively showed that nobody had discontinued the habit merely because importation had been discontinued. Stopping importation, then, is a farce, unless at the same time there is rigid governmental control in those countries that produce or import the drug. And, therefore, unless there should be cooperation of all governments, it is futile to try to regulate the traffic. As long as people can get opium, they will smuggle it. It has been demonstrated to be quite practicable for all the opium-producing countries to make the drug a government monopoly. It would be equally practical for them to sell directly to those governments that use it for governmental distribution. The only obstacle to an international understanding is that the producing countries know very well that government regulation would materially lessen the sale of the drug. Within the borders of our own country such a system would simplify rather than complicate present conditions. We have today along our frontier and in our ports inspectors trying to stop the illicit traffic in opium, and the money thus spent by our government would be more than sufficient to handle and distribute all of the drug that is needed for legitimate purposes. Any druggist could, of course, continue to buy all that he wished, but he would have to account for what he bought. The drug would serve only its legitimate purpose, because the druggist could sell it only on prescription. This would at once eliminate the gravest feature of the case, the indiscriminate sale of proprietary and patent medicines containing small quantities of opium. The physician would thus have to shoulder the entire responsibility for the use of any habit-forming drug. With the government as the first dispenser, and the physician as the last, the whole condition of affairs would assume a brighter aspect, for it would be a simple matter to get from the physician a proper accounting for what he had dispensed. Thus, the new crop of users would be small, and less than 10% of the opium at present brought into this country would be sufficient to meet every legitimate need. Habit-forming drugs. The important habit-forming drugs are opium, cocaine, and the small but dangerous group of hypnotics. These last, trional, veronal, sulfonal, medinal, etc., are chiefly coal tar products, and are not always classified as habit-forming drugs, but they are such, and there are many reasons why the sale of them should be scrupulously regulated. The opium derivates go under the general head of narcotics. Morphine is the chief active principle, and codeine and heroin are the chief derivatives of morphine. Codeine is 1/8 the strength of morphine. Heroin is 3 times as strong as morphine. Though the general impression is otherwise, the users of heroin acquire the habit as quickly and as easily as if they took morphine. Many cough and asthma preparations contain heroin, simply for temporary alleviation, since, like opium, it has no curative power whatever. From time to time I've had to treat cases of heroin taking in which the victims had thought to satisfy their need for an opiate without forming a habit. In the cases where it was given by prescription, it was so given by the physician in the sincere belief that it would not create a habit. All this despite the fact that heroin is 3 times stronger than morphine, and despite the fact that physicians know that anything which will do the work of an opiate is an opiate. Codeine, notwithstanding the fact that it is weaker than morphine, is likewise habit-forming. Yet doctors prescribe it on account of its relative mildness, even though they know that it is the cumulative effect of continued doses, and not the quantity of morphine in the dose, which results in habit. As with morphine, to use either of these drugs effectively means in the long run the necessary increase of the dose up to the limit of physical tolerance. The most harmful of all habit-forming drugs is cocaine. Nothing so quickly undermines its victim or provides so short a cut to the insane asylum. It differs from opium in 2 important ways. A man does not acquire a habit from cocaine in the sense that it is virtually impossible for him to leave it off without medical treatment. He can do so, although he rarely does. On withdrawal, he experiences only an intense and horrible depression, together with a physical languor which results in a sleepiness that cannot be shaken off. Opium withdrawal, on the other hand, results in sleeplessness and extreme nervous and physical disorder. In action, too, cocaine is exactly the opposite of opium, for cocaine is an extreme stimulant. Its stimulus wears off quickly and leaves a corresponding depression, but it confers half an hour of capability of intense effort. That is why bicycle riders, prize fighters, and racehorses are often doctored or doped with cocaine. When cocaine gives out, its victim invariably resorts to alcohol for stimulus. Alcoholics, however, when deprived of alcohol, generally drift into the use of morphine. The widespread use of cocaine in the comparatively short period of time since its discovery has been brought about among laymen entirely by patent medicine preparations containing small quantities of it. These have been chiefly the so-called catarrh cures, which of course cure nothing. With only a 2 to 4% solution they have created a craving, and in the end those who could do so have procured either stronger solutions or the plain crystal. As with the other drugs, in order to maintain the desired result, the dose must be increased in proportion as tolerance increases. Wherever the sale of patent medicines has been restricted to those presenting a physician's prescription, the consumption of cocaine has been at once lessened. A man cannot afford to get a physician's prescription for a patent medicine, and even if he could, the reputable physician refuses to prescribe one that contains cocaine. When an overseer in the South will deliberately put cocaine into the rations of his negro laborers in order to get more work out of them to meet a sudden emergency, it is time to have some policy of accounting for the sale of a drug like cocaine. It is also extremely important to regulate the sale of hypodermic coal tar derivatives. All the group of hypnotics should be buyable only on a physician's prescription. They all disturb heart action and impoverish the blood, thereby producing neurotics. No physician, without making a careful examination, will assume the responsibility of prescribing for a man who comes to him in pain, yet a druggist does so constantly. He knows nothing of the customer's idiosyncrasy, that, for instance, an amount of veronal which would not ordinarily affect a child may create an intense nervous disorder in a particular type of adult. To the average druggist a headache is only a headache. He does not know that what will alleviate one kind of headache is exceedingly bad for another kind, and furthermore it is not his business to warn the customer that a particular means of headache alleviation may perhaps make him a nervous wreck. The patient usually has the same ignorance. In a case which was once brought to my attention, a girl swallowed 9 headache powders within 1 hour. Had there been 10 minutes' delay in summoning a doctor, she would have died. As it was, she was seriously ill for a long time. These, then, the narcotics, cocaine, and the hypnotics, are the chief habit-forming drugs. They form habits because it is necessary to increase the dose in order to continue to derive the apparent benefit obtained from them in the beginning, and because, when once the habit is set up, it cannot be terminated without such acute discomfort that virtually no one is ever cured without medical help. In drug addictions the condition of most patients is not mental, as is generally supposed, but physical. Definite medical treatment to remove the effects of the drug itself is imperative, whether the victim be suffering from the drug habit alone or from that habit in a body otherwise physically disordered. With regard to the cure of the habit, as in the case of the conditions which permit of its being acquired, it may justly be said that the victims have been unfairly treated. The need of control by the government and by physicians. The prevalence of the drug habit, the magnitude of which is now startling the whole civilized and uncivilized world, can only be checked in one way, by controlling the distribution of habit-forming drugs. With the government as the first distributor and a physician as the last, drug-taking merely as a habit would cease to be. If physicians were made accountable, they would use narcotics, hypnotics, and cocaine only when absolutely necessary. Nobody should be permitted to procure these drugs or the means of using them or any medicines containing them without a doctor's prescription. By such restriction the intense misery due to the drug habit would be decreased by 9/10. Indeed, by much more than this, For when a physician dares no longer to be content with the mere alleviation of pain, which is only nature's way of announcing the presence of some diseased condition, he will seek more zealously to discover and remove its cause. Chapter 2.
Habits That Handicap by Charles B. Towns. Chapter 2. The Need of Adequate Specific Treatment for the Drug Taker. The Internal Revenue reports are the only index to the extent of the drug consumption in the United States. They show for years past an annual increase in the importation of opium and its derivatives and cocaine, and for the last year a very marked increase over that of any preceding year. This is not due to the increase in population. Our immigrants are not drug takers. Among the thousands of drug users that I have treated or known, I have never seen an Italian, a Hungarian, a Russian, or a Pole. Moreover, I have met only with 4 cases of drug taking by Hebrews. Few Jews, except in the underworld, acquire the habit knowingly. It may become fastened upon them through the use of a medicine, the danger of which they do not realize, but, once freed, they will not again come under its power. The practical sagacity of their race is the surest safeguard. What is commonly spoken of as the American type, highly nervous, living under pressure, always going to the full limit or beyond, is peculiarly liable to disorders that lead to the habitual use of drugs. We are all hypochondriacal by nature, prone to take something whenever we feel badly. Lack of opportunity alone, of knowledge of what to take and how to procure it, has saved many a person under severe physical or mental strain from recklessly resorting to drugs. Since the passage of the Pure Food and Drugs Act, which was intended to protect the public by requiring the express statement of any dangerous ingredients in a compound, the sale of preparations containing habit-forming drugs has perceptibly increased. It seems just an inference that the information given, instead of serving as a warning to the unwary, has been chiefly effective in pointing out a dangerous path to many who otherwise would not have known where to find it. Women, it should be said, though constitutionally more liable than men to feel the need of medicines, form the lesser portion of the drug-taking class. In the beginning their addiction is due almost exclusively to a physician's prescription, except in the underworld. The habitual users of drugs in the United States come from every grade of society: professional men of the highest responsibility and repute, labourers wearying of the dullness in a mining camp, literary men, clergymen, newspaper men, wiretappers, shoplifters, vagrants, and outcasts, all are among the number. Strangely assorted as they are, they become yet more strangely alike under the influence of the common habit. Shoplifting is not confined to the professional thief. It is noticeable in many a drug user who has had every moral and worldly advantage. The major part of the habit-forming drugs used in the United States is consumed by the underworld. It would be impossible to calculate the extent of their influence. Many a record of heinous crimes tells of the stimulus of a drug. But when the school children in some of our larger cities are found to be using cocaine and able to buy it at will, the limit of tolerance has surely been reached. The drug-taking physician, nurse, and pharmacist. Among the widely varying classes of drug users, 3 in particular are a source of the gravest danger: the drug-taking physician, nurse, and pharmacist. To realize this, one has merely to recall that the drug taker is a confirmed evader of responsibility, and the physician of all men is in a responsible position. He must not forget or break his appointments. He must realize the effects of the medicines he is prescribing. If a surgeon, his work must never be below its best. But the proportion of physicians that I have treated or consulted with suggests one specifically grave danger. It is a characteristic of the drug taker, no matter who he is or how he acquired the habit, on the smallest excuse to advise others to take the drug, whenever pain or fatigue gives the slightest occasion for it. While he grows callous to everything else, he has an abnormal sympathy with suffering. Thus it will readily be seen that there are few more dangerous members of society than the physician who is addicted to a drug. The fact that there are more drug-taking doctors speaks volumes for the high character of the profession. The physician has such drugs constantly at hand. The more a man knows of their insidious action, and the more he handles them, the more cautious he feels himself to be, and the more confident that he can discontinue the use of them whenever he chooses. Any fear that the layman may have of them is due less to the dread of being personally overcome than to the mystery which surrounds them. But for the physician they have no such mystery. Furthermore, by the nature of his calling, he is peculiarly exposed to the need of such drugs. He is often under excessive physical and nervous strain, not only because he is unable to arrange his work so as to prevent periods of too great pressure upon his time and strength, but also because, in a unique manner, he puts his heart into it. An even greater danger in some respects is the drug-taking professional nurse. Whatever has been said of physicians, both in the way of extenuation and of warning, may be repeated of nurses. They have the same exposure to the habit, and, once addicted, are likely to exhibit signs of irresponsibility. They are more dangerous in that their opportunity for mischief is greater, since they are closer to the patient and able to thwart the doctor's orders with perfect freedom. I have had several nurses on this drug case, a doctor once said to me, and I find that they have all smuggled morphine to my patient. This was no doubt an exceptional case, but the fact remains that nurses, because of their close alliance with druggists and doctors, find it comparatively easy to purchase drugs and hypodermics at any drugstore without causing the slightest suspicion or reproof. Nor should one censure them too severely for clandestine compliance with the demands of a patient. It should not be overlooked that the nurse, in being paid by the patient and not by the doctor, is ordinarily subjected to great pressure when the patient clamours for morphine. In such circumstances, the protection of a physician's monopoly of the drug would be most welcome. But how much worse is the pressure when the well-intentioned nurse is also a drug-taker. The morphinist has an abnormal sympathy with those who have undergone or are undergoing experiences similar to his own, and there is no stronger bond than that which unites two morphine victims. As a matter of the most elementary precaution for all concerned, no nurse should under any conditions be allowed to buy habit-forming drugs. Another kind of drug-taker against whom physicians' distribution would be a safeguard, and the only safeguard that can be devised, is the pharmacist. The contingency of a drug-taking pharmacist, perhaps more than anything else, will bring sharply home to the average man the menace of morphine when used by a professional person. By reasons of closer and more personal observation, one may feel rashly confident of his ability to detect when a doctor or a nurse is queer, but generally the patron of a drugstore has no such opportunity for observation. Addiction to a drug incapacitates the pharmacist for filling prescriptions. Often the slightest deviation from a precise formula in either quantity or ingredient is of the gravest consequence, and hence the utmost care should be used to ensure the scrupulousness of one on whom such responsibility rests. As long as he is accountable to no one, or even accountable to the government only on a business basis, there can be no safety for the public. If he may sell to any purchaser other than a physician, he may always supply his own wants. But if he has to account to a physician for the entire amount of habit-forming drugs that he distributes, any leakage may quickly be detected by the man who more than anyone else can be relied upon to stop such a leakage promptly and sternly. A pharmacist should be allowed to dispense habit-forming drugs only on a physician's prescription. The physician should be limited as to his authority, not only for prescribing such drugs, but As the Boylan Act provided, there must be a careful accounting on his part for all such drugs administered or given away. In other words, he must account for all such drugs which he buys for office use, and he cannot prescribe such drugs except under certain definite limitations. Methods of treatment: the home cure. For many years only two methods of dealing with the drug habit were known. They continue to be the only ones in general use today. They are the home cure and the sanatorium method. Neither is in any proper sense a treatment, or anything more than a process of substitution and deprivation. In many of the periodicals and daily papers are carefully worded advertisements setting forth that a man may be cured of a drug habit quickly, secretly, painlessly, and inexpensively. These are written by people who thoroughly understand the mental and physical condition of the drug taker. In almost all cases he wishes to be freed from the habit, but at the same time to avoid the disgrace of being classed with drug fiends. He is unwilling that even his family or his intimates should know of his condition. He has exaggerated sensitivenesses to pain, upon which also the advertisement relies. Furthermore, attention is directed to the fact that the patient may take the alleged remedy without spending much more money than he has been spending for the drug itself. Naturally, a powerful appeal to a man of limited means. Moreover, the people who take these cures are generally those who are unable to consider the expense of leaving home. That the advertisement is very alluring to the average drug taker is shown by the fact that in my entire practice I have encountered few patients who have not at some time or other taken a home cure. A minister wrote to me the other day, begging me to cure a fellow minister of the cure habit. His friend had had occasional attacks of renal colic, and a physician had eased their acuteness with a hypodermic. The patient, of course, knew what he was taking, and since he was forced to consider the cost of the physician's visits, for the mere administration of the hypodermic, he naturally procured his own outfit, and in a short time was using it regularly upon himself. When he found that he could not leave off the practice, he entered into correspondence with a succession of home cure advertisers, whose clever use of the word privacy offered a hope that his condition might be concealed from his congregation. For 10 years he had been undergoing the cures, and during all this time had been forced to take a regular dosage of the so-called remedies. Before the passage of the Pure Food and Drugs Act, the ingredients of such remedies were not stated. The patient seems never to have suspected the truth, that the bottle contained the very drug he had been taking, its presence disguised by added medicines. In certain instances the makers boldly advertised that a trial bottle would be sufficient to prove clearly that the taker could not get along without using his drug. Now that the law compels a list of dangerous drugs on the label, the cures proceed admittedly by a reductive principle. The patient graduates from a number 1 bottle to a number 2, containing less opium, and so on, until finally he is supposed to be cured. The proprietors of these cures make a great deal of capital out of the fact that the reduction is so gradual that the taker experiences no discomfort. This consideration is highly effective, for while it irresistibly appeals to the morbidly sensitive morphinist, it also makes him comprehend as time goes on why the process of cure is so slow. It is hardly necessary to state that the final stage is almost never reached. Almost without exception, the basis of restoration to health is the perfect elimination of the effects of the drug. It should go without saying that it is impossible to eliminate the effects of opium with opium, or to find any substitute for opium that is not itself opium. At the International Opium Conference in China, I exhibited 76 opium cures, which I had analyzed and found to contain opium. And, as a consequence of the Pure Food and Drugs Act, all the American cures announced on their labels that they also contained it. Thus it is easy to see why the sale of these cures had always greatly increased wherever the rigid enforcement of anti-opium enactments had closed up the customary sources of habit-forming drugs. Up to the passage of the Act, however, the presence of opium in the American cures was concealed, and their formulas were kept secret, and hence all of them, by the very nature of the case, were put forth either by irresponsible persons or by persons outside the pale of the profession. For one of the pledges given by a physician is that he will not patronize or employ any secret treatment, and that he will give to the profession whatever he finds to be of benefit to his fellow men. In very rare cases these home cures have been able to relieve a man of strong will power, with the added assistance of a regimen for building up his bodily tone. But these cases have been so infrequent as to be virtually negligible, for to administer the treatment successfully demands from the patient the exercise of precisely that power of self-control, the loss of which drove him to the cure in the first place. If there ever was any curative property in one of those so-called cures, a man could not be benefited unless he were under constant supervision. A treatment of this sort must, except in a case of a miracle, be administered by another and under continuous medical surveillance. A man addicted to a drug, be he physician or longshoreman, in a short time becomes utterly unable to deal justly with himself, for it is the nature of the drug to destroy his sense of responsibility. The sanatorium treatment. Besides the home cure, there was, and is, the sanatorium treatment. Unlike the former, this was first established and carried on by trustworthy medical men, who depended for their support upon the patience of reputable doctors. A physician who had a morphine patient was obliged to send him to a sanatorium, because there was nothing else to be done with him. Elsewhere no course of treatment under constant surveillance could be given. It afforded the only opportunity of carrying the patient through the long period of gradual reduction which was then the only known treatment. Thus there was nothing optional about the matter. The physician could not recommend a home cure, and the only means of approximating systemic treatment was the sanatorium. Furthermore, those relatives and friends who knew of the patient's condition were anxious that he should go to one, since they realized the increasing awkwardness of keeping him at home. In many cases, indeed, they even went so far as to resort to means of commitment if they failed to get his voluntary cooperation. It is due to the ease with which this type of patient can be committed that the state of Connecticut, for instance, abounds in sanatoriums. In that state, when a patient has entered one of them, he can often be detained there virtually at the pleasure of his relatives and friends. The method of treatment at most of the sanatoriums is like the home cure, except that it is under surveillance. That is, it is merely one of gradual reduction accompanied by an upbuilding of bodily tone. The morphine taker, with means and time at his disposal, will stay in a sanatorium as long as he can be made comfortable. This shows that whatever reduction he has undergo is extremely slight, for gradual reduction, when it is carried to any extent, sets up a highly nervous state, together with insomnia and physical disturbance. The patient, as is often said, has an exaggerated dread of discomfort, and will not, if he can help it, endure it at all. Unless he is committed, he transfers himself to another sanatorium the moment he ceases to be made comfortable. I had one patient whose life had been a continuous round of sanatoriums. He would stay in one place until the point was reached where discomfort was in sight, and then to remove to another, remaining there for a similar period, and then to another, and so on, until he had finished a long round of sanatoriums to his taste in America and Europe, when he would begin all over again. A patient of mine who had visited 8 different sanatoriums in the vicinity of New York told me that in America the sanatorium treatment of neurological patients was divided into 3 great schools: the forget it system, the don't worry system, and the brace up system. Any nervous invalid who has stayed much at sanatoriums will appreciate the humor of this classification. The gravest aspect of these long stays at a sanatorium is the unavoidable colonization. Picture to yourself a group of from half a dozen to 50 morphine patients, eating together, walking together, sitting on the veranda together day in and day out. In this group are represented many different temperaments and many different stations of life, from the gambler to the clergyman. All the more on this account is there a general and eager discussion of previous history and present situation. For where the alcoholic is quite indifferent, the morphine victim has an insatiable interest in symptoms. He has also an excessive sympathy with all who have been through the same mill with himself. Thus, in a matter where individual and isolated treatment is imperative, most sanitariums deal with patients collectively. Furthermore, these are peculiarly a class of unfortunates who ought never to become acquainted. Whatever moral restraint the habit has left in a man is completely relaxed when he hears constant bragging of trickery and evasion and has learned to envy the cleverness and resource so exhibited. The self-respect and pride which must be the main factors in his restoration are sometimes fatally weakened. Colonization should be restricted to the hopeless cases, and to them only because it is unhappily necessary. Failure of the reduction method. All this, moreover, is never, or almost never, to any purpose. As the uncomfortable patient will move if possible, it is naturally the business of the sanatorium to keep him from being uncomfortable. The method of reduction, therefore, is rarely carried out to the point where it would do any good, even if good were thus possible. But it is not possible. In the first place, lessening the dose is of little avail. There is as much suffering in the final deprivation of a customary quarter of a grain as of 20 grains. In the second place, it cannot be ascertained by gradual reduction whether there is any disability which makes morphine necessary, since no intelligent diagnosis can be made so long as a patient is under the influence of the smallest quantity of the drug. Obviously, the first step in taking up a case should be to discover whether any such disability is present, and if so, whether it is one that can be corrected. Otherwise, it may be a waste of time to try to correct it. The true physical condition of the patient, which should be considered before a long course of treatment is undertaken, can seldom be discovered by the reduction method. The best doctors have always felt that they could not afford to lend their names to any institutions or sanatoriums except those which restricted themselves to mental cases. Yet these home cures and sanatoriums, unscientific and ineffective as they were, have offered to the victims of the drug habit the only hope they could find. The investigations begun by Mr. Taft in the Philippines extended over considerable time and cost $250,000, but, although furthered in every way by the whole world, they failed to discover a definite treatment for the drug habit. It was generally believed by physicians that there was no hope for the victims of it. Cost of the drug habit. It may be noted that I have not dwelt upon the expense of the habit. This consideration may be omitted from the case. To the average victim, the cost of his drugs, no matter what he may have to pay for them, seems moderate. He is buying something which he deems a vital necessity, and which, moreover, he places, if a choice be required, before food, drink, family, sleep, pleasures, tobacco, every necessity or indulgence of the ordinary man. The real cost is not to the drug taker, but to the world. If a human life be considered merely as a thing of economic value, an estimate may perhaps be made of the total loss due to the habit. But the loss should not be reckoned in any such way. It should rather be reckoned by the amount of moral usefulness and good that might be rendered to the world if these unfortunates could be freed from their slavery, and by the actual harm being done by them especially by those that are now loosely classed as criminals and degenerates. The retrieving of much of the waste of humanity may be accomplished by adequate treatment of the drug habit. End of chapter 2. Habits That Handicap by Charles B. Towns. Chapter 3. The Drug Taker and the Physician. The doctor who begins to take the drug in order to whip his flagging energies into new efforts finds the habit fastened on him before he realizes what has occurred. His endeavors to reduce his daily dosage fail, and he becomes thoroughly enmeshed. His acquired tolerance for the drug has brought about so great a physical change that deprivation or even reduction of dosage is intolerable. Hundreds of cases where physicians had experimented with the drug with these disastrous results have been brought to my attention. No one shows less foresight, less appreciation of the danger of tampering with drugs than the physician himself. I am constantly amazed by the fact that any doctor will take even the slightest risk of becoming a drug user. That many voluntarily incur the peril passes my understanding. I have seen an astonishing number of physicians who, for various physical reasons other than exhaustion and the need of stimulant, considered themselves eligible to experiment with drugs. It is a curious thing that, as a class, physicians and surgeons themselves singularly averse to submitting to surgical operation, even when symptomatic indications strongly urge it. Why surgeons in particular should so generally dread the application of the knife in their own cases is a puzzle, for of course no class more thoroughly understands the need of surgery. I could mention many cases of this sort, but one in particular recurs to my memory. He was one of the most careful and best informed doctors in the country, and he was not without a certain special knowledge of the peril involved in habit-forming drugs. But he suffered from a painful rectal trouble, and although he considered himself too intelligent a man to go too far with a dangerous substance, he did go too far. He had thought that he could leave drugs off whenever he desired. He found that he could not. The physician who takes drugs. It is impossible to make even an approximately accurate guess at the proportion of physicians who are drug users. Everywhere except in New York State, physicians can obtain as many drugs as they desire without publicity and without laying themselves open to any penalty whatsoever, even if their purchases are brought to official attention. No medical organization takes any cognizance of drug-taking physicians or provides any medical help for them. It is highly probable that the New York State legislation may uncover some of the drug-taking doctors in that Commonwealth, though this is by no means certain, since legislation in force in only one state cannot effectively put a stop to the illegal importation of habit-forming drugs from the other states and countries. Proper restrictive legislation of sufficiently wide scope would very quickly disclose every drug-taking doctor in the nation, and either force him to correct his physical condition or drive him from the profession. Proper general regulation of the traffic and consumption of habit-forming drugs will aid tremendously in freeing the medical profession from drug takers. Until this general regulation exists, no general reform will be possible. An exact accounting for every grain of habit-forming drugs which he purchases, possesses, or administers must be demanded of every physician in the United States before this evil can be entirely abated, and this accounting among physicians will be impossible until a similar accounting is demanded of every grain imported, manufactured, and dispensed by wholesale and retail druggists. Concerning the extent of the hold which the drug habit has upon physicians, I have had a rare opportunity to judge. Not only has my dealing with the drug habit been exclusively as possible through the physician rather than through the patient, but the brevity of my treatment and the privacy that my patients are assured make it possible for many physicians who have become afflicted to come to me for relief without arousing in the mind of any one a suspicion of the real cause for their brief absence. I therefore feel that I have a firm basis for accuracy. It is the fear of disgrace which has driven hundreds of physicians from bad to worse with the drug habit. They become apprehensive that any effort tending to their relief will uncover their position to their families, associates, or patients, and thus bring ruin. So they have drifted on from bad to worse. Many who have not taken steps in time have reached the irresponsible and hopeless stage. To the medical profession in general, as well as to the public, these men are a dreadful menace. Attitude of the profession. I, a layman, have been greatly surprised that the medical world shows so little sympathy for these unfortunates. This seems to me to be specifically reprehensible, since by this neglect they imperil the public. No greater service could be rendered to mankind by the medical profession than a concerted movement of the medical organizations towards the care and relief of those among their drug-taking members who are still susceptible to help, and the exclusion from medical practice of those who have already gone too far to be reclaimed. Physicians of this class who are without means are specially entitled to sympathy and help, and this service will be of double value. For it will not only give them necessary aid, but will notably safeguard the public. No physician should be permitted to practice who is addicted to the use of habit-forming drugs, or who uses alcoholic stimulants to excess. But whatever is done in regard to these men should be accomplished without publicity and without any loss of pride or standing. A doctor who has used either drugs or alcohol is much more to be pitied than blamed. The worthy practitioners, and there are many, who must resort to the use of drugs in order to enable them to practice despite some physical disability which cannot be eliminated, are no less numerous in proportion to the total number of physicians than similar cases are in relation to the total number of lawyers, merchants, or journalists. But because of their work, they are far more dangerous to the general public. It seems to me that there is in this fact the existent non-elimination of such perilous characters from the practice of medicine, and the obvious, very real necessity for an elimination, a suggestion for some person of philanthropic mind. If the medical profession will not care for its own, then someone else must care for them. It occurs to me that among the people whose naturally fine impulses are leading them toward the endowment of institutions for the care of the aged, maiden lady, or superannuated teachers, or others to whom fate has been unkind, there are many who might well consider this great need for the establishment of a comfortable institution in this country for the care of physicians who through no fault of their own have become unable to practice their profession with profit and efficiency. How the doctor becomes a drug taker. The doctor's yielding to the drug habit is a simple process. In 99 cases out of 100, unaccompanied by any unworthy tendency towards dissipation. In another part of this book I make extensive reference to the fact that nowhere in the textbooks by means of which the medical students of the world receive their education is any proper attention paid to the psychology of the drug habit. We may assume that a doctor, having lost sleep because of a difficult case, is confronted on his return to his office by another that demands immediate and skillful attention. He is tired, and very likely he himself is ill. He cannot yield to his worries or illness, as he would demand one of his patients to yield. He must brace up. He knows that in the stock of habit-forming drugs that he uses in his profession lies the material which will brace him up. He tries it. It succeeds. This doctor has begun to nibble at the habit, and he does not know his danger. He himself does not believe that one or two or a few doses will fasten that habit upon him. He finds that a certain dosage produces the necessary desired result upon the first day. He is stimulated to new efforts in behalf of his patients, and because those new efforts are the result of stimulation, they produce abnormal weariness. This exhaustion must be overcome, and the result is another dosage of the drug, and this time the dosage must be larger than the first, for both his toleration for the drug and his weariness have increased. Only a few days of such experiences are necessary to fasten the habit upon him. I have often endeavoured to imagine the thrill of horror which must chill a doctor's soul when he finds that this has happened. His position is a dreadful one. He has lost control. He must tell no one, for if he tells, disgrace and the loss of his means of livelihood will be but matters of a short time. He knows nothing of any means of real relief. He cannot help his family. He is familiar with the dangers attendant on the fake cures which are widely advertised. He is confronted by a stone wall. He must either continue his dosage, thus enabling him to keep on with his practice, or he must accept ruin and defeat, and to continue his dosage is the easiest thing imaginable, for the drug has been by law entrusted to his keeping and is close at hand. Another doctor who is specifically susceptible to drug addictions is the one who has been accustomed to alcoholic stimulation. Any doctor who drinks alcohol when he finds himself beset by arduous labor involving loss of sleep, or is confronted by cases of such a complex nature that they involve a great deal of mental worry on his part, is likely to drink more than usual. Thus, work and worry, the two things which make him most liable to the effects of any stimulation, are likely to drive him into overstimulation. Overstimulation results in supernervous excitation. The victim finds himself unable to sleep. He finds his hand tremulous. He finds his thoughts wool-gathering when they should be concentrating with intensity upon his work. In his pocket-case there is his little morphine bottle. He knows its action, and when called to see a patient while under the influence of alcoholic stimulants, he attempts to steady himself by the administration of a small dosage. The result is virtually instantaneous, and at first marvelously effective. He finds himself enabled to do better work than he has done for years, and more of it. The remedy seems magical. He tries it again and again. The man is lost. Such instances as these have produced the most utterly hopeless of the many cases of drug addictions among physicians with which I have come into contact. Types of drug users. Specifically numerous among drug victims are physicians in nose and throat work, where they make daily employment of cocaine solution. Some of the most desperate cases of drug habit that I have ever seen among physicians have come from this class, made familiar with the constant use of the drug by the necessity for continually administering it to their patients. Another physician who is specially liable is the man who suffers severe pain from a physical cause that he knows can be removed only by resorting to surgery. The average doctor will postpone a surgical operation upon himself until his condition has long passed the stage that he would consider perilous to any of his patients. While he postpones it, he is suffering, and while he suffers, he may be more likely to continue his practice through reliance upon the stimulation and pain-deadening qualities of habit-forming drugs, concerning the true and insidious nature of which he usually knows no more than the average layman. There have been a few cases of physicians who have yielded unworthily to drugs and opiates as a means of dissipation. I have known some physicians, for example, who have been opium smokers. In the United States, the opium smoker is invariably unworthy. Not long ago, the New York police raided the apartment of a physician, where were found 30 or 40 opium pipes, and more than 100 pounds of opium, either crude or prepared for smoking. I have known fewer than half a dozen physicians whose drug vice was purely social, however. The victims of a drug habit who achieved it through a tendency toward dissipation are almost invariably denizens of the underworld, and if it were not for the fact that the contagion of their vice may spread, they might well be permitted by society to drug themselves to death as speedily as possible. We shall entirely disregard the physician who becomes addicted to the use of drugs through unworthy tendencies, and consider only the dangers to the profession and the public latent in the case of the physician who becomes addicted in the less reprehensible but more dangerous manner that I have indicated. Not only will such a drug addiction injure the doctor's practice and threaten his career, It will surely constitute a threat against the welfare of his patients, not included in the possibility that though he may miss engagements, write improper prescriptions, and make mistakes of many kinds. The drug-taking physician a menace. A very serious danger lies in the psychology of drug addictions. The person who has taken a habit-forming drug for the purpose of relieving his own pain, and through it has found that relief which he sought, is almost certain to become abnormally sympathetic to the suffering of others. It is a curious fact that this doctor will be more likely to administer the drug he uses to his patients, not with malicious, but with probably friendly intent, and that he will feel no scruples whatsoever in acting as a go-between for drug users in general who find themselves unable to obtain supplies easily. He will do what he can to help confirmed users to obtain their drugs, even if he makes no profit out of it. He will write prescriptions for them in evasion, if not in violation of the law. It is a curious and tragic fact that the drug-taking doctor will spread the habit in his own family. There have been many instances in my hospital when I have had a physician and his wife as patients at the same time and on the same floor. In every one of these instances, the drug addiction of a wife has been the direct result of constant association with the drug-addicted husband. No more dangerous detail exists in the psychology of drug users than their almost invariable tolerance for the habit in others and their sympathetic willingness to promote its spread among those who suffer pain. In the underworld, the drug habit never travels alone. Through it, the woman who is a drug user holds the man whom she desires. Through it, the male drug taker holds the woman whose companionship he finds agreeable. It is a curious fact that while in the underworld the drug habit has become a social vice, especially in the case of cocaine, and is frequently a proof of mixed sex relations in the upper world, it is accompanied by a secrecy of method and sequestration of administration that characterizes no other form of vice. The difference between the psychology of the doctor's relation to the drug habit and that of the layman to it may be summed up in the statement that while the layman does not at all know what he is getting, the doctor knows what he is taking, but thinks that he can stop taking it whenever he feels ready. It is probable, therefore, that the doctor's primary danger is as great as the layman's, and it is certainly true that his secondary danger, that growing out of the fact that he has drugs, and the instrument for their administration always ready to his hand, is very much greater. The unnecessary administration of habit-forming drugs to the sick must be legally prevented as far as possible. No affliction which can be added to an already existing physical trouble can compare in horror with that of a drug habit. Numbers of cases have come under my observation in which physicians have accomplished exactly this addition to the ruin of their patients' health, to the incalculable distress of the sufferers' families, and to the vast loss of society. In the recent legislation written upon the statute books of New York State, the first definite effort is made to provide against this catastrophe. End of chapter 3.
It's That Handicap by Charles B. Towns. Chapter 4, Psychology and Drugs. Drug habits may be classified in three groups. The first and largest is created by the doctor. The second is created by the druggist and the manufacturer of proprietary and patent medicines. And the third, and smallest, is due to the tendency of certain persons toward dissipation. The major importance of the first two groups is due to the fact that they include by far the greater number of cases, and to the pitiful fact that such victims are always innocent. Speaking generally, and happily omitting New York State from our statement, it is safe to say that the manufacturer, the druggist, and the physician are without legal restraint, despite their importance as promoters of drug habits, while the comparatively unimportant drug purveyor in the underworld is held more or less strictly in control by the police and is subject to severe punishment by the courts in case of conviction. With few exceptions, the part which the doctor plays in the creation of drug habits is due to lack of knowledge, but the druggist's part in the spread of this national curse is purely commercial, and may justly be designated as premeditated. He always has gone and always will go as far as is permissible toward creating markets for any of the wares that he sells. Regulation of the upper world in regard to the distribution of habit-forming drugs will automatically regulate the underworld in its similar activities. The amount which will be smuggled by those of criminal tendencies always will be small as compared with the amount improperly distributed through channels now recognized as legitimate, until all the states have passed restrictive legislation founded upon, modeled after, and cooperative with New York State's legislation. And all this must be backed and buttressed by federal legislation of a special kind before real and general good can be accomplished in the United States. Illicit drugs rarely find their way into the possession of users who have acquired drug habits through illness or pain. So it must be admitted that most of the effort that in the past has been made toward restrictive legislation has really been devoted to the interests of the unworthy rather than to those of the worthy. Save in New York State, the man or woman with a sheepskin, the doctor, the druggist, or the nurse remains virtually a freelance, permitted to create the drug habit in others or in himself or herself at will. The doctor a means of spreading the drug habit. The man in severe pain is immediately exposed, by the very reason of his misfortune, to the physician with a hypodermic or the druggist with a headache powder. The man who cannot sleep may, at any moment, be made a victim by the physician whom in confidence he consults, or by the druggist to whom he may foolishly apply for something which will help him to secure the necessary rest. Save in New York State, the druggist's shelves are crowded with jars and bottles holding dangerous compounds which he may dispense at will. His drawers are crowded with neat pasteboard boxes containing powders which are potent of great peril. The public will have made a long step toward real safety when it realizes that any drug which brings immediate relief from pain, or which will artificially produce sleep, is an exceedingly dangerous thing. The sick man's confidence in his doctor is one of the doctor's greatest assets. It has saved innumerable lives. It is of the same general nature as the mysterious mental phenomena which frequently control physical conditions, and which have been capitalized by various bodies, such as Faith Cure and Christian Science. But if this is an asset to the physician, the general public knowledge that he carries in his case or in his pocket drugs which he can use without restraint of law for the relief of pain may become a general peril. In the old days, when the doctor's work was a mysterious process, operating by methods of which he alone was cognizant, this peril was less well defined. But now that the spread of education has made everybody a reader, and periodical literature of the times has given even children a smattering of knowledge concerning medical matters, the nature of the means by which the doctor works his miracles is well known, and his unrestraint may become a public peril. Of 1,000 patients who may consult the average physician, 999 know perfectly well that he can stop their pain if he desires to do so. Pain is unpleasant. Naturally, their demands that he use his power are insistent. If he refuses, they are likely to call in another and less scrupulous physician. The medical profession is overcrowded, and perhaps the doctor needs the money. Even if he is swayed by nothing but financial need, he is likely to be tempted into the administration of pain-deadening substances when his patient urges him. There is another powerful influence which works upon the most admirable of men, the pity of the temperamental physician, for the human sufferer. Most men who choose the medical profession as the avenue for their life work have the qualities of mercy, pity, and sympathy notably developed in their psychology. This is likely to induce them to stretch points in favor of relieving suffering patients. Even when their previous experience has proved to them the danger lying in narcotics, they are likely to forget it, or to take a chance if a special emergency arises. This may be done without great peril to the patient. Danger of the knowledge of pain-relieving drugs. The physician should exhaust every means known to medical science to prevent his patient from knowing what it is that eases pain when his practice makes it absolutely necessary that a substance of the sort should be administered, and this is very much less frequent than the average doctor realizes, as will be shown in another passage of this book. It is in this necessity for concealment that the great danger of using the hypodermic syringe as an administering instrument principally lies. The moment the hypodermic syringe is taken from the doctor's or the nurse's kit, the sufferer is made aware of the means which will be used to give him ease. He remembers it, forming a respect and admiration, almost an affection, for the mere instrument, and with the most intense interest gathers such information as he may find it possible to acquire about this wonder-working little tool and the material which is its ammunition of relief. He knows absolutely that the relief which he has found is not due to medical skill, but to the potency of a special drug administered in a special way. He stops guessing as to whether he has been soothed by an opiate. He knows he has been. It is not only those of weak psychology or mental characteristics who are affected by this knowledge, and who through it become drug takers, though it is the general impression that this is the case. No impression was ever more inaccurate. The mentally strong and the morally lofty are as much averse to suffering physical pain as the mentally weak and the morally degenerate. All are in the same class when the drug has been administered, until that point of tolerance is reached where its administration cannot be neglected without the indignant protest of the physical body. That this fact should be impressed upon the medical profession as a whole is one of the most needful things I know. Another hazard which the doctor runs if he passes the point of extreme caution in the administration of drugs to patients is the possibility, even the probability, that through such an administration he will lose control of his patient. From the moment the patient becomes cognizant of the means which the doctor has successfully used to alleviate his pain, he begins to dictate to the doctor rather than to accept dictation from him. No doctor can control a case successfully unless his judgment is accepted as the supreme law of treatment. A patient who is not susceptible to the doctor's dictation cannot be expected to get the full advantage of the doctor's skill or knowledge. If diagnosis shows that a patient requires some operation, as in certain uterine troubles, or more especially in the case of bladder affections or gallstones, cases in which frequently only an operation can give relief, and if that patient is aware that even if the operation is not performed, the doctor can still ease all suffering, that patient, loath to run the risk of the surgeon's knife, horrified by the thought of hospitals and operating theaters, is likely to demand the relief which opiates offer, and refuse to risk the cure which surgical procedure alone would certainly afford. The conscientious doctor who insists upon the proper course in such a case is seriously handicapped by the presence in the medical profession of many men who are less conscientious, and who may yield more readily to the urgings of the patient. Thus, the possibility of unrestricted use of habit-forming drugs by the medical profession becomes a handicap to the conscientious man and a commercial advantage to the unscrupulous practitioner. Unconscious victims of the drug habit. Episodes occurring continually in the course of my work add to the strength of my conviction of the physician's responsibility. For years, not a week has passed which has not brought me patients with stories of the manner in which they have become victims of drug addiction through the treatment of their physicians. Lying before me as I write is a communication from a young man in Pennsylvania. He had been hurt, and through improper surgical attention, a healing fracture had been left intensely painful. The attending doctor, unable to correct his imperfect work, had left with him a box of tablets to be taken when the pain became severe. Promptly and inevitably, the youth achieved the drug habit. He felt disgraced. He would not tell his father, his wife, or his sister. His doctor could give him no relief. By some accident he saw an article of mine which was published in the Century magazine, and made a pitiful appeal to me. I have received many such communications. A pathetic letter comes to me from a woman suffering with fistula. Having achieved the morphine habit as the direct and inevitable result of taking pain-killing drugs given to her by her family physician, she now feels herself disgraced. Like many sensitive women who in this or some other way become victims of the drug habit, she is obsessed, as her letter clearly shows, with the conviction that her achievement of the habit has been a personal sin, and that her continued yielding to it puts her beyond the pale of righteousness. She writes that she finds herself incapable of going to her church for Sunday services or to prayer meetings because she feels ashamed when in the imminent presence of her Maker. Another woman, evidently animated by a similar psychological phenomenon, writes that having acquired the drug habit, although blamelessly, since it was through the administration of narcotics by her doctor, she finds it a psychological impossibility to kneel at her bedside and offer that prayer to God which it had been her nightly practice to deliver. I could multiply such instances indefinitely. It is impossible to conceive any episodes more pitiful than the cases of this sort which have been detailed to me by drug victims, doctor-made. That feeling of disgrace, that unjustified conviction of sin on the part of absolutely innocent women victims of the drug habit, is apparently among the most terrible of humanity's psychological experiences. If I had the pen of a Zola and the imagination of a Maupassant, I might properly impress the medical world with a sense of its responsibility in this matter. Without it, I fear that I may fail to do so, but could I accomplish only this one thing, I should feel that my life had been of use to that humanity which I desire above all things to serve. No work could be of more importance to the world of sufferers than one which would put the use of these potentially beneficent, but alas, often injurious drugs upon a respectable basis, so that the man who must be given the relief which they alone can offer may no more hesitate to tell his neighbor that he is taking morphine than he now will hesitate to tell his neighbor that he is taking blue mass pills or citrate of magnesia. The responsibility of the trained nurse. That the medical world should ever have been so lax in its realization of its proper responsibility as to allow trained nurses to carry hypodermic syringes and to administer habit-forming drugs seems to me to be one of the most amazing things in the world. No physician who has had an extensive experience with drug addiction, and who has any conscientious scruples whatsoever, will fail to make sure, before he leaves a nurse in charge of a patient, that the attendant possesses no habit-forming drugs, and is without any instrument with which they may be hypodermically administered. If such drugs are to be used, they should be kept in the physician's possession until they are used, and should be administered by means of an instrument which he carries with him. When such drugs are left, the nurse should give an accounting for every fraction of a grain. I have no desire to convey the impression that in my opinion all nurses are untrustworthy or unscrupulous, but it must be remembered of them, as it must be remembered of the doctor, that they are in the employ of the patient, that their income depends upon giving satisfaction to their employer, and that they are likely to make almost any kind of concession and resort to almost any practice in order to make comfortable and profitable assignments last as long as possible. It is impossible not to admit the truth of this statement, and it must be recognized that if it is true, a nurse is under too great a responsibility when she is in possession of a hypodermic kit, particularly if the patient knows that it is her kit, her hypodermic, her drug, and that she will not be called to account by the physician for such drugs as she may administer. It must be rather disconcerting for a physician to reflect upon the fact that a nurse whom he has left in charge of a critical case, through greed or even through the general and admirable quality of mercy, is equipped for, and ignorantly may yield to the temptation of resorting to a practice that may not only undo all the good his treatment has accomplished, but in addition may afflict the patient with suffering more terrible than any which disease could give. This element of mercy, soft-heartedness, and readiness to pity must specially be remembered in considering the relation of the trained nurse to the patient. If men are often induced to enter the medical profession because of its presence in their soul, even more frequently are women led by it to become trained nurses. The sympathetic woman is even more likely to yield to the pleadings of suffering patients than is the sympathetic male doctor. It must also be remembered that, like the doctor, the nurse is human, and neither iron-nerved nor iron-muscled. She is frequently under terrific strain, which makes her tend toward the use of stimulants of any kind. That which she can administer to herself by means of the hypodermic is closest to her hand, is easiest to take, and is least likely to be discovered. Again, too, it must be remembered that the nurse is as susceptible to pain as are the rest of us, suffering with the means of alleviation at her hand, and, like the doctor, ignorant of its true peril. What is more natural than that she herself should use the hypodermic for her own relief? Thus it comes about that probably a larger proportion of trained nurses than of doctors are habitual drug users. This is not a statement which is critical of the profession, for if all mankind knew of drugs, had hypodermics, and knew how to use them, a very large proportion of the human race would resort to this quick and effective, if inevitably perilous, means of finding comfort when agony assailed them. The world cannot understand that while to the normal human being the worst that can come is pain, the worst pain is vastly less terrible than the horrors which at intervals inevitably afflicts the habitual drug user. No one human being who has become a victim of a drug habit through its use for the alleviation of pain, but will voluntarily cry after he has come to realization of the new affliction which possesses him, "Save me from this drug habit, and I will cheerfully endure the pain which will ensue." The horror of pain is not so great as the horror of the drug habit. After very serious reason for extreme caution on the part of the medical profession in regard to the use of habit-forming drugs is that the effects of such drugs upon a patient must also certainly make accurate diagnosis of his case difficult or even impossible. A patient whose consciousness of pain is dulled or eliminated by the use of drugs cannot accurately describe to a physician the most important symptoms of his ailment. Without the assistance of such a description, the physician is so handicapped that all the skill which he has acquired in practice and all the knowledge he has gained from study are apt to be of no avail. Indeed, in the case of habitual drug users, accurate diagnosis of any physical ailment is impossible until the effect of the drug has been so completely eliminated that not one vestige of it remains. End of chapter 4. Recording by John Thomas Kuzmarski. www.thenerdcoach.com.
.org. Habits That Handicap by Charles B. Towns. Chapter 5. Alcoholics. I am not specially familiar with the statistics of insanity, but am inclined to believe that an appreciable contribution to the total, indeed one of its largest parts, has arisen from the improper diagnosis of drug and alcoholic cases, followed naturally by improper medical treatment. Lack of definite medical help in cases of chronic alcoholism is likely to bring about brain lesions, which eventually mean hopeless insanity. For that special reason, the chronic alcoholic has been the chief contributor to the army of the insane, and in the asylums his presence is notably frequent among the violent cases. The head of one of the greatest institutions in the United States for the care of the insane assures me that this seems to occur among women to a greater degree than with men. One of the most difficult problems of my work has been to discover ways by which the medical profession can be made to understand the really serious meaning of chronic alcoholism. Most delirium, the primary cause of which lies in alcoholism, is amenable to treatment. Effects of deprivation in chronic alcoholism. It is exhaustion or lack of alcohol which first produces delirium in an alcoholic case, whether that exhaustion is due to the patient's inability to assimilate food or alcohol, or whether it is due to the fact that, being under restraint, alcohol is denied him. In most cases, there is no form of medication which can be successfully substituted for alcohol, and unless definite medical help is provided for the purpose of bringing about a physical change and thus avoiding delirium, no course remains safe except a long and very gradual process of reduction of alcohol poisoning. Such a measure as this cannot be successfully applied in the wards of the General Hospital, as the mere fact that alcohol was there administered, even in slowly diminishing doses, would make such a ward the chosen haven of innumerable old stagers, who, having reached that stage of worthlessness which would make it impossible for them to obtain the narcotic elsewhere, would take the treatment for the mere sake of getting the alcohol of which it principally consists. Many friends of alcoholic subjects and many physicians in private practice have believed that they were doing the alcoholic a great service when they put him where he could not get alcohol, and helped him over the first acute stages of the period of deprivation by the administration of bromide and other sedatives. This usually means delirium first, and then a wet brain. If the patient survives this, his next development is more than likely to be prolonged psychosis, or in the end, permanent insanity. It is because of this that I consider the chronic alcoholic more clearly entitled to prompt and intelligent medical treatment than most other sick persons. With the alcoholic, as with the drug taker, the first thing to be accomplished is the unpoisoning of the body. In order to accomplish this, it is first necessary to keep up the alcoholic medication with ample sedatives, using great care lest the patient drift into that extreme nervous condition which leads to delirium. If delirium does occur, nothing but sleep can bring about an improvement in the patient's condition. This is the point of development at which physicians not properly informed in regard to such cases are likely to employ large quantities of hypnotics, and frequently this course is followed until the patient is finally knocked out. In many instances, an accumulation of hypnotics in the systems of persons thus under treatment has proved fatal. I am rather proud of my ability to state that from delirium tremens I have never lost a single case. Necessity of classification of alcoholics. The records show that today about 40% of the insane in the asylums of New York State have a definite alcoholic history. In this condition lies one of the greatest opportunities ever offered to the medical profession. Even now a proper classification of the patients thus immured, and their appropriate treatment, would in many instances result in the return to the normal of those affected. Proper classification and treatment at the time when the symptoms of mental disorder first appeared would have resulted in the salvation of innumerable cases. As a matter of fact, I earnestly believe that if this course was followed, the number of supposedly permanent cases of insanity arising from alcoholic and drug addictions might be decreased by 75%. Certain general rules may be laid down. There are no circumstances in which it is advisable for a physician in private practice to attempt to handle a case of chronic alcoholism in the patient's own environment. Efforts to do this are constantly made, with the result that many needlessly die from lack of alcohol, while an even more tragic result is the unnecessary entrance, first into the psychopathic wards of our hospitals and thence into our asylums for the insane, of innumerable cases which needed intelligent treatment only for alcoholism or drug addiction. If this treatment is neglected, the incarceration of these unfortunates in asylums becomes necessary, for without question their insanity is real enough. Unscientific methods in the treatment of alcoholism. During the summer of 1913, I visited a large hospital in Edinburgh and discussed alcoholism and its treatment with the visiting physician. "We do not have many alcoholics here," said he. "Why?" I inquired. "All our hospital work is supported by private subscription," he answered. "Then there is no place whatever in Scotland for the care of the acute alcoholic case?" "No, if an intoxicated person is locked up by the police and develops delirium, he is sent here and we do what we can for him by the old methods." "You offer no definite medical help along special lines?" "No, we have none to offer." He showed me 2 cases in the general ward. One man in a straitjacket was in the midst of delirium tremens, his face terribly suffused. He was in a pitiable state, and nothing was being done for him. "What course shall we follow?" the physician inquired. "Let me see his chart," I requested. After I examined it, it became immediately apparent that the patient's condition was due to lack of his usual drug. It was his 3rd day in the ward. "Nothing but sleep will save him," I said, and suggested medication, which was administered. In 3 or 4 minutes the patient was relaxed and taken out of the straitjacket. I made certain suggestions regarding general stimulation for the bowels and the kidneys, and diet. On the next day I found the patient improved after 12 or 15 hours of sleep, and wholly free from delirium. His case had now become simply a matter of recuperation. Another case had lived through several days of delirium tremens, which had been followed by a wet brain. The visiting physician considered this patient a fit subject for the psychopathic ward. I asked the patient questions about himself. He was sure that he had been out the night before, and pointed out one of the interns as his companion during the hours of dissipation. His case was regarded at the hospital as almost certain to end in an asylum. I suggested treatment, and within 2 days the man's mind had entirely cleared up. These instances of successful and prompt relief occasioned considerable surprise among the hospital physicians, who frankly admitted that they knew nothing to do except to keep the patients there under restraint, and, if necessary, feed them according to existing rules to keep their bowels open and their bladders free, and hope for the best. This was an institution which is supposed to represent the best medical learning in the United Kingdom. I found similar conditions existing in the great hospitals of London, Paris, and Berlin, so that the Scotch institution is not an exception to the general European rule. Everywhere I was frankly informed that the medical staff knew of nothing to be done in alcoholic cases beyond deprivation and penalization. Nor have we been more scientifically progressive in the United States. We are following virtually the same unenlightened methods, and it has even been suggested that chronic alcoholism be added to the conditions which in the minds of some sociological thinkers justify sterilization. How important our shortcoming is may be strikingly illustrated by the statement that alcoholic patients comprise 1/3 of all the cases admitted to Bellevue Hospital in New York. The difficulty of treatment in some alcoholic cases. The alcoholic differs notably from the person addicted to drugs. A drug taker, deprived of his drug, will experience in the early stages only acute discomfort and a natural longing for the drug of which he has been deprived. His unfavorable symptoms can always be relieved by the administration of the drug. The chronic alcoholic, however, deprived of the stimulant, often drifts into a delirium which cannot be relieved by the administration of his accustomed tipple. No more terrible spectacle can be imagined by the human mind than that of an acute case of delirium tremens. No patient needs more careful watching in order that unfavorable developments may be avoided. Once delirium sets in, no type of case is medically so difficult to handle. The man who for long periods has been saturated with alcohol, and who is suddenly deprived of it, is, I think, more to be pitied than almost any one I know. Yet relatives, friends, and physicians frequently follow exactly this course, and think that by so doing they are rendering the patient a kindly service. Causes of insanity. In mentioning the causes of insanity, it is, however, impossible to permit the impression to be recorded that alcohol is the only offender. My statement of the part which alcohol plays in supplying the population of our madhouses has never been denied. But it is also true that the use of headache powders and other preparations commonly sold at our drug stores, and as yet slightly or not at all restricted by law, and the use of coffee, tea, and tobacco in unrestricted quantity, also contribute their quota to the insane. A letter from the superintendent of a certain state asylum tells me that he has seen many improvements, sometimes even amounting to cures, result from 10 days of fasting. That fasting really was a process of unpoisoning. In such a case, the symptoms of insanity may be attributed to auto-intoxication, coming from one of many causes, of which alcohol, tobacco, or even food improperly selected or unreasonably eaten may be one. The physician can have no means of learning just what method to pursue in any case of auto-intoxication until the patient has been unpoisoned. If any one of the great general hospitals would secure careful histories of 100 of its patients, and apply the proper methods to those who are found to have been poisoned by their habits, surprising results would be achieved. It is specially true that no intelligent mental diagnosis can be made of any patient who has had an unfavorable drug, alcoholic, or even tobacco, tea, or coffee history, until he has been freed from the effects of these drugs or stimulants. The first thing that a physician must do when confronted by a case of alcoholic or drug addiction is to learn whether it is acute or chronic. If the case is chronic, the patient must not be suddenly deprived of his stimulants. End of chapter 5.
Thank you for watching. Do subscribe to